I'm good right here. Yeah. Okay. Hey, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. We're going to get with the program in just a minute here. This is kind of a milestone, maybe along the way between the beginning of Envision Chaffee County and some ideas about how we might be able to take better control of our own destiny and our future and ensure maybe that some of the things we really care about actually do persist long into the future. And towards that end, you know, we had a fairly significant campaign effort this summer and fall on the ballot measure 1A. And there's definitely a number of people here in the audience tonight that worked hard on that, and also some folks up here on the stage. And not going to go through it all, but just it was a good effort. And like all campaigns and elections, one of the key functions it provided us was a platform or an opportunity for discussion. And see that with individual candidate campaigns. You certainly see it with ballot measures where you're talking about specific issues. So I think that I can say for myself, I learned a lot, let's say, through the campaign, both about the specific issues that we're trying to address, but also about how best to move such things forward. In that regard, I do want to take 1 minute and thank the critics who spoke up either against the measure or our process, or maybe just the fact that there were issues that weren't adequately addressed or appeared vague, uncertain. Those were great comments. Those were taken to heart, taken very seriously, and in particular, I got to call out Merle Baranchik, frankly, in the Mountain Mail and the Chaffee County Times, because without that really public forum, it'd be hard for us all to express our views in a way where we can kind of get to see what we all are thinking. And I think Merle himself really made some valid points about our efforts. And a big part of what we're doing tonight is probably inevitable in this kind of process, but it is also in response to some of the criticisms or concerns about the uncertainties that things that weren't nailed down. So I do feel it's just important to acknowledge it takes courage sometimes to speak out against something as much as it does in favor, and a lot of those comments were really taken to heart. And some of those questions were specifically, how are you going to structure this? How are you going to make sure that you're accountable for these taxpayer monies, these funds, and certainly pointing out the importance of transparency. So that's really where we're picking up now is, okay, we didn't want to go through the Herculean efforts you're going to hear about shortly, researching other programs around our region, trying to figure out best practices and pulling all that together. We were reluctant to spend the 6 weeks or so that's gone into that prior to the election and knowing whether we had a program to work on or not. So that work has been done. This meeting's been fairly well advertised, I think. We're videotaping it tonight, just so you know, in the interest of full disclosure, you'll be filmed. And we're gonna put that on YouTube so people who couldn't attend tonight will be able to see that. And then the PowerPoint that we're going to use tonight will be on our county website tomorrow morning. We'll have that up there so you can refer back to it or share it with friends who are doing other things this evening. I'm going to go over the next steps in our process at the end of the PowerPoint, but what I want to do now is, if you don't know them already, introduce Cindy Williams and Rick Hum, who took it upon themselves to conduct a research project on sort of conservation finance measures broadly in Colorado and in a few other states where it regarded forestry and forest health and wildfire mitigation. So they interviewed folks from, I believe, 10 different communities and really tried to pull together best practices, lessons learned, and then come up with a set of recommendations. So they're going to take us through the process that they went through. And when they're done, again, I'll have a few more points to make about process following this, and then we want to hear from you. So this is really an opportunity for us as commissioners, and for all of us to hear, not for us to hear you, but also for all of you to hear you, and to see what we may have missed along the way or what sounds really good, and help us zero in, because we are hoping to move forward here in the near term and really pull this thing together and get it going. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Cindy and Rick, unless you guys have anything to add. And
welcome, and thank you for being here.
We'll get this underway.
Right, thanks. Can everybody hear me okay?
No, I think you might have to hold the microphone.
Do you think, how about now? Still not. Way close. Yeah. Dang. Okay, I'll get myself up here. Thanks to the county commissioners for asking for this research. Board of County Commissioners asked if the community could have a look into how programs like 1A worked in other communities. So Rick and I and Ben Lenth, who couldn't be here tonight, worked together and did a series of interviews. So we might frame that conversation in the context of Envision. So we started out almost 2 years ago. The Chaffee County Commissioners convened the Envision Chaffee County process, intended as a community-wide planning effort. Out of Envision came 4 different visions for the future of Chaffee County. And out of those visions, action teams came up with some really interesting work. One of the visions was around having a forest that's healthy and fire resilient. Out of that came a goal shared between the community and the Forest Service, where we realized that we need to roughly double the rate of treatment that we're doing in our local forest to make this community more fire resilient and to support our wildlife habitat at the same time. A second vision that came out of that was a vision of having healthy forest and recreation, which is growing very rapidly in Chaffee County, that remains in balance with those. So this wasn't against recreation growth, but it was saying we got to find ways to manage that recreation growth that also protects the very assets that people come here and live here to enjoy, and our quality of life along with them. And out of that came some shared need for things like maybe toilet facilities or hardening recreational assets or finding ways to disperse use. And then finally, we also had an important vision that came out, which was this vision of maintaining our rural landscapes and having new growth focused in and around towns. And out of that came a vision to not only support the existing tools like conservation easements that are out there to help protect our working land, but also to develop additional tools, Chaffee County tools that would help keep working lands working. And there was a lot of discussion through Envision about something that looks like a payment for ecosystem services that provides a way for the community. Says 97% of the community says we value our agricultural landscapes, and 90% of ranchers probably say, gosh, we want to keep those working lands working. We're asking how can we connect those two in the Envision process, and what tools can we come up with that can make that happen. So after all that, I think everybody was left, we were left with the community action plan, which had 40 great projects, but this question, which everybody asked, right? This is great, but how do we really do them? Excuse me. This is Rick's idea. This slide is a pretty cool idea. And out of that, of course, came County Ballot Issue 1A and the Yes for Protecting Forest, Waters and Working Lands campaign, which of course was approved by voters in the last election. And just as a quick recap, there's nothing new here. This is exactly what's in the ballot language itself. But just a recap of what it does and doesn't do, ballot measure 1A. I'll give you a second to read through there because I don't want to read it to you. So you can see we allocated some specific buckets of funds, the commissioners did in their defining resolution, for specific items, but there was also a desire to have flexibility to move dollars, the remaining 45% of dollars, between those three defined buckets. They can't go just anywhere. They got to go to one of those three buckets, depending on the need of the year in question, and at the discretion, of course, of the Chaffee County Commissioners. And then captured up there is some of the thoughts on some of the specifics in the resolution language around how those funds can be used. So nothing you knew there. I just wanted to recap that. So then what Rick and I and Ben Lenth and a few others did is we did interviews with 10 communities who had ballot initiatives with similar uses of funds. Those included Arapahoe County, Eagle County, Grand, Gunnison Park, Pitkin, and Summit counties in Colorado. And then we also reached out to Flagstaff, Arizona. They're one of the first and only communities to pass a ballot measure specifically for fire protection. So we had a chat with them, and we also talked to Ashland, Oregon, who's another one of few communities in the U.S. that has a wildfire protection measure in place. And then we also had a conversation with Gates Family Foundation just around their learnings about how to best set these up. So we asked all these folks the same set of questions, and we captured that in a report, which I think will also be available out on the county site. It's out right now on the Envision Chaffee County site. We really just asked them how are they set up, what's working for them, and what didn't work, or what did they learn so that we don't have to learn it again ourselves. And so we walked through what we learned. What we found out at a high level, we found 3 different models of how communities set these things up. There's one set of models that are essentially models that are managed by county staff. If you think of Boulder's a good example of this, Pitkin County is also a good example of this. These are big open space programs where the county is actually purchasing open space or purchasing easements or doing conservation easements. And they're holding those and they're managing the open space, they're building trails, they're managing parks, all that kind of stuff. And they typically have pretty big county staffs involved in that. I mean, Pitkin County they raise about $11 million a year, for example, on their tax measure, and they're spending $3 million a year on county staff. So that's one model. A second model is a model that we saw in Grand County and in Park County. That's a little bit closer to how you might think of Chaffee set up and how the ballot measure was set up. Those are programs where there's a Citizens Advisory Council. They're receiving grant requests from organizations, they're rating and ranking those, and they're making a recommendation to the commissioners. And the county is involved in supporting those with some county staff, but a lot of the weight of that rating and ranking is sitting on that citizens committee in these communities. And then the wildfire mitigation programs we found were a little bit different than both of those two. In those, we found a lot of partnerships going on between local government and the agencies managing the public lands and nonprofit organizations all working together in collaborative partnerships. So they were just a little bit of a different measure. Would I miss anything?
Nope, that's good.
So we observed in these communities, some communities that had, we asked all these communities what worked. And we found some success factors that were pretty common between all these communities. Every one of these communities, all 10, have a Citizens Advisory Council of some sort who are rating and ranking and recommending uses of funds to the county commissioners. And in all cases, the county commissioners are then making the final decisions on those use of funds. We heard from a lot of communities that what works is if they start out right up front with a clear agreement between that group and the county commissioners on what the big goals of the program are. And I think we've developed some of that work already through the Envision process in Chaffee. So I think we have a good platform, but clarity that a clear understanding of that helps. We did see a few communities where the Citizens Advisory Council and the BOC kind of went in different directions in it, and then they had to figure out how to bring it back together. In all cases, we saw that some degree of county staff was engaged in helping, providing support certainly for management of the funds, but also helping with the administration side, and in almost all cases helping with communications in making sure that the community was always transparently informed and engaged. And then we found in all communities that the advisory council preparing grant criteria and some sort of a rubric or a rating criteria for those grants. And Rick might just talk a little bit about what we do in Chaffee, because actually one of the very best examples we saw of setting up that grant ranking criteria was right here in Chaffee County with the Marijuana Excise Tax Advisory Board, of which Rick's the chair.
As you may recall, the marijuana excise tax passed in 2016, and the commissioners appointed Marijuana Excise Tax Advisory Board, and we spent a few months working together to develop how our rating criteria would be established and rated, and then we developed a scoring rubric in our application process off of that. And I think that's a good model for what we'd want to do here. This is going to be a little more complicated because since we have 3 areas that are to be funded, we want to be able to score proposals within each area, but also be able to compare them across the 3 areas, since there's the 45% that can move from one area to the other in any given year. So it's going to be an interesting process, but I think we've got a fairly good model of how to get that started.
If we move towards the Citizens Advisory Committee specifically, we saw a number of things that are pretty consistent in communities that have had good success. We saw usually those committees are about 7 people. We saw a range of 5 to 8. We saw a couple communities that tried bigger than that. Eagle County actually tried 13 people, and it was just not manageable for them, and they ended up pulling that back to 7 just in the last election cycle, in fact. Of course, having clear job descriptions and code of conduct's a common factor in the best practice systems. And then in all cases, these advisory council folks are selected by the Board of County Commissioners, and the best practice we saw is that they're selected first on a set of skills and on a shared view of the program goals overall, as opposed to being advocates for one specific area or location. And then second of all, most having some sort of a representation on a geographic basis. And what most counties do is they have a skill sets, and then they also say at least one shall be from each of the Board of County Commissioner districts or each school district or something like that, so that they make sure they get a fair mix across the county. There's a few that just say, look, we're going to make sure we have a reasonable geographic distribution and leave it at that. And then we heard a lot, especially from Gates Foundation, just the importance of the folks on this committee having being committed to the big picture and the county first and all those sorts of things. What I miss?
I think you got it.
Okay.
Fine.
Oh, yeah. And we heard that this takes real time on the part of the committee members, that this is a working commitment, and it's not just that they come once in a while and give their opinion. They're in, and they have some serious time commitment asked. And we said in Chaffee County, if we had a look at that, the best example of this we saw actually was in Eagle County. They have a really nice definition of their skill sets that they just came out with in this last election cycle when they reframed their committee. And we tried to mimic that in Chaffee County, and we said if we were to do that same thing in Chaffee County, what we would see is a committee that had people that had skill sets specifically in forest management or silviculture, specific skill sets in recreation management, specific skill sets around agricultural operations. And of course, on the forest side, we're talking about management in fire prevention and people that have those technical skill sets. And then we also said in Chaffee County, we think a pretty strong nice to have is folks with understanding of conservation tool sets. Both conservation easements and fee land acquisitions are one possible use of funds. So we think that committee should have somebody who has some familiarity with those tools. Wildlife skill sets, I think we think are an important one. And then some, as the METAB has benefited from, some leadership background and experience in setting up programs and bringing people together. And then there's some additional value backgrounds there that we've seen in other counties too. Some counties look for local business owners. Some counties look for folks, at least one person on the committee that's from the county, that's kind of born in the county, that has that deep-rooted understanding of the community, historic assets, things like that. And then maybe the most important thing on this whole slide is our estimate, and Rick maybe can talk to this coming from METAB, is that the time ask for the folks on this committee in Chaffee County is going to feel something like 15 to 20 hours a month, plus 2 meetings a month, certainly at least in the first year. And maybe you want to build on that from your experience?
With MedTab, we had a fairly compressed period of time, but we were meeting every other week and sometimes every week. And frequently there would be drafts going back and forth electronically between the meetings. So there is going to be a real desire here, I think, for this committee to dig in and work on the various criteria, compare the 3 funding areas to make sure that we've got a reasonable balance and that we're weighting the criteria properly. Some of the important criteria that we think we'll want to incorporate is that local organizations will be weighted heavily. Leveraged funds, if you can bring in GOCO funds or State Forest Service funds or others, National Forest Service funds to weigh on the project, those should be weighted. So each of the criteria should be ranked very carefully, and it takes a good deal of time to work through that.
Good builds. A couple of additional governance lessons. I think we already talked about size matters in the size of the committee. Regular meetings required between the Citizens Advisory Council and the Board of County Commissioners, so the board is consistently updated and aware of what's in the pipeline and what's going on and can provide feedback back and forth. And then you might talk a little bit about the software requirement. We're seeing in communities with more complex programs going to a management software.
Yeah, Lake County said they managed their program off of an Excel sheet for many years, and it just started to get away from them. With MedTab, we've been looking at grant management software, and we did an evaluation of the 10 highest rated grant management packages, and MedTab is recommending that the county consider Fundant. That's a very robust but very popular grant management software package. MedTab was interested in buying that for this year's grant cycle, but it was a little pricey from our perspective. It was going to be $8,000 for the first 2 years implementation. And since MedTab only had $100,000 to work with this year, we didn't want to spend that much on an administrative tool. But with having 2 sets of grant programs running, we think it makes sense for the county to seriously consider an online grants software package.
And then one last slide of lessons learned before we go to the recommendations. If we come back to the program at a holistic level, I think that the first one that's up here is extremely important. I mean, what we heard from all these communities is to be patient. I mean, what we heard in most places is that it took them 2 or 3 years to get everything set up and running smoothly and all that. So I think we want to make sure in Chaffee County we don't have the expectation that somehow there's a magic wand that, that one of these guys holds and in 6 months or 9 months it's all going to be up and operating smoothly. It's going to take time to develop all this, and I think we want to make sure we're patient with ourselves and give ourselves the space to be creative and get it set up smartly. We definitely heard in some counties that they went a little bit too fast and they were so focused on getting early wins that they got some early wins that maybe weren't the ones that the community felt like were wins. So we want to select those early wins carefully. We definitely heard a strong theme through everybody that the most successful programs had really good community collaboration, a mechanism of ongoing community engagement into these and clear and transparent communications. A strong theme everywhere. Rick mentioned we saw that most programs look towards local organizations as in preference to non-local organizations for grant funds. They worked hard to leverage funds. The best we saw, I think, Gunnison County somehow has actually achieved a 12 times leverage, but on average communities are doing about 1.5 times leverage on their money, which means in Chaffee County we might hope to expect. We might certainly prefer grants that are bringing some additional funding to the table. And then as far as forest health related programs go, we heard that providing these dollars directly to agencies hasn't been a good model for people. Rather that they're best set up in partnership with nonprofit organizations and partners and some pretty careful thought on how those dollars transfer. The other thing we heard really loudly and clearly on the forest health side is that it takes time to plan the forest priorities, to work with agencies to get permits in place, to get treatments done, to actually get those marked out. I mean, all that's a process, and the agency has things they need to go through, as well as county entities. So again, I think we heard the message of be patient and don't expect it to be a magic wand. I think that's it. Any other ones you want to add?
No, I think that's good.
So with all that in mind, to bring it all together, we looked at the resolution language that Chaffee County passed, and we listened to what all these other counties said, and we proposed a structure that we think might work in Chaffee County. And I think what we really want to hear tonight is what folks think of it and how we might be able to, what people like and what maybe we're missing. At the top of this, as in all counties, is the Board of County Commissioners. They're ultimately appointing the Community Advisory Council and deciding on use of funds. They're the ultimate decider in all cases. And they're also getting quarterly program updates, so they're always involved. We saw a best practice in some counties where they had one of the commissioners act as a liaison to that Community Advisory Council just to speed things up so that they weren't trying to contact all three all the time. It kept people sane, I think. And then the Citizens Advisory Council, a body that's in our governance language in place to develop grant ranking criteria. It feels like a size of 7 is the best practice that's out there that we've seen, and then some county staff beside that to help support the administrative side as well as communications out to the community. And then in Chaffee County, we this is actually an idea that Greg brought up, and we heard this some from the agencies too, that our program is complex enough that it probably would be helpful for this Citizens Advisory Council to also be able to appoint some subject matter expert boards for each of those 3 areas of funds, where the subject matter experts might be folks like Jim Pitts at the Forest Service or folks in agencies. It might look like recreation managers, might look like folks who are agricultural operators that own and operate agricultural lands, that are able to provide some input into those grant criteria as they develop, and also perhaps as grants are being rated and ranked, that are able to provide some technical input into feasibility. I mean, I think the Citizens Advisory Council isn't going to have, for example, all the background to decide on the best priorities for fire. And we think some expertise on the side as advisors would be helpful in this case. So we looked at a possible structure where the CAC, Citizens Advisory Council, is appointed by the Board of County Commissioners, and then they have at their discretion to appoint some additional teams underneath them that provide some deeper technical expertise. Anything to add? And then we also heard repeatedly from all these communities that having a community engagement mechanism and planning mechanisms as a community that tie into all this is an essential part of success. So we added to that framework that you just saw 2 more layers that we think we already have in Chaffee County. We feel like we have a step ahead with what's going on with an Envision and the community involvement in that. But we added underneath the subject matter experts boards, there's some planning framework programs that are in progress that are just getting kicked off right now in the county. Those include a community wildfire protection plan update tied to the forest health folks, a recreation and balance program, and a program around keeping working lands working. And we think those larger engaged community planning frameworks can also help inform use of funds and also help the community connect into programs and help develop programs that will best use funds. And we see Envision Chaffee County perhaps as being an ongoing mechanism to help facilitate those and just make sure that community engagement happens as an asset that the county commissioners drive. And just building a little bit on those 3 framework programs. So the 3 framework planning programs actually have been working in the background kind of in parallel with 1A to get funding in place. And there's about $500,000 of funding in place right now today for those 3 planning processes, or 3 groups of planning processes. And just so it's all out there. Sorry, I don't know why this is in pieces. So those three programs are at the top, the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. We're just in the process of getting that framed up, and we'll be reaching out to the community to engage them in that, and that's funded by the Department of Local Affairs and sponsored and funded by Chaffee County. So that's getting kicked off as one key planning program. There's a second set of planning programs in the Keeping Working Lands Working space. That includes some funding from Great Outdoors Colorado that Kate Larkin and others helped us get, that provides some programs specifically working on education and legal support for the ranching community. We also have funding in place from Gates Family Foundation to work on that bigger system that's an alternative to conservation easements. We don't know everything about what that looks like yet, but we are ready to reach out to the ranching community and engage and start figuring it out together as a community. And then there's also funding in place for a recreation and balance program designed to develop some monitoring tools countywide and some community planning engagement countywide. That's sponsored by all the agencies that you see up there and funded. So those are all in progress, and the community is welcome to and encouraged to engage in all those. If you're not already involved, just shoot an email to Envision, and we'll get you hooked up, and we'll do everything we can to have those be public out in the papers with the Ark Valley Voice and the Mountain Mail and all as well. And with that, that's a summary of our research and our recommendations, Greg. Over to you.
Great. Well, first of all, Cindy and Rick, I really want to thank you for the tremendous effort you put into this. It's been, took up a lot of your holiday time. I know that, and we really appreciate the depth that you went into, and I think it gives us a good place to really have a conversation about this. A few things about next steps, and then we'll move into public comment.
Can we comment on these
Oh, yeah.
at some point?
Yeah. Would you like to right now? Or do you want
Yeah, let me go ahead right now. There are a couple of comments I want to make so that you hear it straight from the horse's mouth. Could you go back to slide 12, please, Cindy?
I can if you tell me which one's slide 12.
It's the one that lists, right there, that's it. Okay, I won't say this is a contentious issue, but it has been the one thing that we discussed for more than just a couple of minutes as a particular aspect. And I won't say that my position has been misrepresented. I think it's been misunderstood somewhat. Obviously, we want to have the right skill sets. And included in these right skill sets are good communication skills, because some of the things that these people are going to be expected to do is communicate with their various communities and constituencies and elements in their communities where they live, work, and play, to voice those positions and everything on the board. And also convey the board's positions back to their volunteer groups and others. And I'll give you some examples, like Friends of 4 Mile, Friends of Browns Canyon, Upper Arkansas Wilderness Volunteers, all these different groups, to be a liaison between the Citizens Advisory Committee and these volunteer groups. Also, and this is in my thinking, and I think we all share this view, and this is kind of what Cindy and Rick were saying, when we say subject matter experts, we don't mean PhD dissertation level experts in forestry or aquatic wildlife or those sorts of things, but people that have a passion for these things and have done more over their lifetime of studying the issues, reading up on them, and having a good familiarity of the interrelationships between forest health, watershed health, drinking water quality, and all these sorts of things, so that they can have that big picture and do a fair evaluation of how one project might positively impact many other areas. So with that. And then really the one that I want to amplify just a little bit is reasonable geographic distribution. I suggested, based on what Eagle County has done with one representative at least from each commissioner district, that we distribute our 7 members with 1 per each commissioner district and 1 per each municipality and 1 from the county at large. That did not mean that was my primary objective, was that geographic distribution. They both go hand in hand. And the reasons I feel that way are we want to foster community development, community growth, and good communication within the community, and good broad representation of everybody. And then the question came up, well, what do the municipalities, what stake do they have in this? Well, they're where a lot of the impacts are being felt. When it comes to source water protection, when it comes to human waste around trailheads, when it comes to adjacent trail systems and those sorts of things, the municipalities are where the impacts are being felt on a daily basis. And those are some of the reasons that I think, and when we come out of this, one of the things, the product that we're going to develop are the governing documents, the resolution, the ordinance, or whatever that governs this program, and we want to get it right the first time. So that's really why I was advocating that distribution, so that there's some assurance that rather than having something that says we strive for a reasonable geographic distribution, there's a lot of maneuver room in that. So let's put some requirements in there. Let's put some assurances to the citizens that their particular districts are going to be represented. That's it. Okay.
Do you want to go back to that?
You wanted to add, Russ?
Do you want me to go back to that last one for you, Greg?
Sure.
You were
Yes,
just starting to
that'd
tee
be
that up, I think.
Yeah.
Oops.
Okay, so what I want to do now is just take a few minutes, talk about what we see as kind of our next steps so that you have a feel for where we're headed. And then our real emphasis tonight was to hear from you once you'd sort of been informed of the information that we've been presented with in terms of kind of best practices and what other communities have done. So we'll be doing that shortly. And I gotta make one little editorial comment. You know, I go to a lot of meetings, and there's kind of, this to me is more the old school town hall style, where you do have to go up to the microphone if you want to be heard. That's maybe the tough part for some folks, but the good side of it is everybody else gets to hear what you're saying, as opposed to the kind of open house format that we're seeing more of these days, where to me it's kind of a divide and conquer. They spread you out to a bunch of little kiosks and people taking your comments, and it's harder to get a feel for what your fellow community members think, and it's harder to build on a good idea as a group. You can also get pitchforks and torches too, so we'll all keep that in mind, but I'd really like to for all of us to, we're here to listen, and we hope you are too. I think there's a lot we can learn from each other. What we have planned in terms of next steps, our next regular meeting is next Tuesday, the 15th. That's scheduled for Buena Vista. That'll be at the school district offices there. And we'll be putting on the agenda this whole discussion, basically, discussing the kind of creating the structure for this common ground project. We'll also be talking about how we might address the communications and public relations challenge that this presents, and how to go about that best. And we'll also be talking about sort of the application process for folks who would want to participate either at the Community Advisory Council level or at the maybe sort of subject matter expert level, and working through that. We only had 2 meetings scheduled, strangely, this month, and we've added a third, which will be Tuesday, January 22nd, back in Salida. These are morning meetings, 9 a.m., and we will have the same agenda items on our agenda, and hopefully really move towards resolution and a resolution that we can finalize either then or first week of March, so that we can then pull together this application process, get it out to people, give them time, so that we can, by the end of March, have
February.
I screwed that up, didn't I? I skipped February.
It's easy to forget that.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So after our January 22nd meeting, or early in February, I said early in March, we will be finalizing this into a resolution format, finalizing the application forms, getting those out, so that by hopefully early March, beginning of March, we're able to interview candidates and pull this board together and convene it and get it underway. So we have made those schedule changes on our meeting schedule, and that's all ready to go. So unless anybody has anything else, we're going to open it up to public comment. I think our goal here isn't from our end to necessarily respond in any detail to everybody or to debate things or that sort of stuff. This is more just taking it in. If you have questions, we'll do our best to answer them, but really more just for us to listen. When you come to the microphone, we'd like you to give your full name, or first and last name, and your address in the county. We need to record that for our public meetings process. And so, yeah, I think at this point we'll open up the sort of public comment part of this hearing and get underway.
Or just questions is good. Just
Questions are fine.
Six first up.
Good evening. Sig Josted, 19605 County Road 343, Buena Vista. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, I want to express appreciation to Cindy and Rick for their diligent research and thoughtful recommendations for governance and administration of Common Ground, and to you, our Commissioners, for your support of this project. I'm picking on one element of the requirement matrix, and I apologize for redundancy, but I'd like to again emphasize the importance of the geographic representation in the county. And just as an observation, with the seat of government in Slida, it takes a special effort to assure that there's appropriate representation from the northern part of the county in all of our government functions. I won't expand beyond that, other than to say that I'm obviously a northerner. I'm confident that the other requirements of the selection matrix can be met while respecting these geographic representation requirements. One other element I'd like to address also, and it's something that Cindy and Rick are well aware of and are already working at, and that is I'd like to emphasize the necessity of representation of the farming and ranching community on both the Community Advisory Council and the subject matter expert boards. And again, I appreciate the efforts that Cindy and Rick are putting into the whole project in addition to my own priorities. So thank you.
Thanks, Sig. Great meeting.
Wow.
Please.
Football game was last night.
Feel free.
James Thompson, 17065 County Road 338. I agree with the boards, but I think in the expert advisory assistance that we have enough people in this county in all three areas that we should have somebody that is not currently working in the various fields but has the expertise, because I know personally when you're looking at forest mitigation and you've got a number of applications, you're talking at least 3 hours to 4 hours on each site, and then you've got to put a lot of stuff together to turn around and make a summation to the committee in selections in that area. And in recreation, we've got enough people in this county that have a lot of experience in recreation, and we've got the ranchers, but I think we need to have people with expertise that are part of government. But I think your primary lead person should be somebody that is either retired from the Forest Service, the State Forest Service, or is a private forester or retired private forester to be the lead person. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Allison Brown, 11600 Antelope Road. I think you've got some really good things going on here. But one area that I've got questions on as a citizen, and since this is taxpayers' money, it's a tax on the citizens, is to do with conservation easements. Now, first of all, I'm a huge advocate of conservation easements. I've looked into them myself for my own property. But I look into it, basically on the profit and loss side as a property owner. And there are significant advantages, tax benefits, and so forth that are put in place by the state to incentivize landowners to go into conservation easements. Now, there's fees involved. So I hear, one of the use of this taxpayers' funds, is to incentivize conservation easements, possibly even paying fees. So the question I've got here, is it the intent that this would be blanket? Anybody who applies for a conservation easement would have their fees paid? If not, how is the county looking at who gets their fees paid, who doesn't, in terms of the benefit to the taxpayers? Or are you considering an incentive program where maybe the subsidization of the fees, but the benefits, the financial benefits that come back to the landowner who puts the conservation easement in and receives those benefits then has to pay that back? So since this is taxpayers' money, I think those are fair questions for the public to have answered.
Just to clarify, Allison, when you're talking about fees, and just to clarify for everybody, you're kind of talking about the transaction costs that are often remain after the easement's done, and that often flows back to the landowner to cover.
Well, that's the money that comes back to the landowner. You get the tax benefits, and those tax benefits are actually marketable. You can sell them on, there's a stockbroker for them. You get 80% of the value in cash. So these are big incentives in many places. In many cases, ranchers have put their land into conservation easement, quite frankly, because they're cash poor. And it still allows them to use them. As I said, I'm a huge fan of it. I think it's a great program. But we're talking about taxpayers' money here. So, I think it either has to be across the board, like fees are waived for everybody in Chaffee County who puts land into a conservation easement, or if not, there has to be some criteria other than just a citizens board saying, this is my neighbor, I think it's a great idea, we should pay his fees.
Got it.
Or you use it as a way of subsidizing fees, because again, a lot of these cases are places when landowners are cash poor, and the fees are paid up front, but then the money goes back into the pool. Yeah. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do, yeah.
Okay. I just think these are points that need to be considered.
I think Rick may be able to comment on that.
Rick, did you?
We did touch on the topic of reimbursement of the fees that are paid by a public entity. And many of the open space programs said, that's a great question. We've been talking about that for years and we haven't done it yet. So it is something that is on the table and I think should be on the table. Both the criteria in terms of if you've got a rock star that owns 1,000 acres, do you want to pay their transaction costs? Probably not. And if somebody does get a very large tax break because of their conservation easement, should they be required to repay the transaction costs if they were paid up front by the public entity? We think those are things that should be on the table as we build this program.
I'm in 100% agreement. I'm just suggesting these are things that should be part of a public discussion, not maybe put to a decision of a citizen advisory committee.
And one other thing that Rick and Cindy and I discussed when we met is incorporating those elements into the scoring rubric so that, again, things based on like aquifer recharge potential, wildlife corridor potential, and those different cost elements you're talking about would weigh into how well something's scored on an application. Those are things that we're talking about and we're having to explore, and they can be changed at a future date as a part of the scoring function without having to go back and do a very complicated process and many times. So we are really interested in hearing what people's thoughts are on all that sort of stuff.
Well, understood, but basically the taxes here, from the hardworking citizens of Chaffee County are quite frankly small potatoes compared with the tax incentives that the state will give back,
Yeah.
which are
And that
the
was a
true
concern-
incentive.
That was a concern that we heard during the campaign.
Yeah.
People were very concerned that they were perhaps underwriting, somebody else's lifestyle or something, so.
Man, this guy looks familiar, but I can't quite place him.
Joel Benson, 215 Tabor Street in Buena Vista. Thank you for pulling this all together, and thanks, commissioners. I guess, Keith, you mentioned the scoring matrix, and I know there's got to be a lot of brain power that's going into what that is and how that comes out at the other end. I'd encourage within that maybe special attention to water, like keeping water rights in the valley and keeping, be explicit about that water for those kind of projects, just because of the sensitivity of water use in the West, and also consideration for maybe, I know various organizations are going to apply for these, but if there's multiple organizations coming together, that there's that considered within that scoring matrix. So thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joel.
I'm Brad Leach. I live at 13512 County Road 258A, Salida. Just a couple of points to consider. The first having to do with the 3 bins that the funds are required to go to, the 25%, 25%, and 5. It might be worth thinking about that requirement being on a 3-year rolling average basis. I guess I'm thinking it's conceivable there might be some year when the requests for grants, there just might not be very valid requests one year for one of those particular bins. And it would be too bad for the Citizens Advisory Committee to have to feel like they have to approve something they're not really a big fan of just to make that minimum requirement. Whereas if it was on a 3-year rolling average, there's just a little more flexibility with that. The other point, again, has to do with the geographic diversity for the selection of the Citizens Advisory Committee. I understand the need to want to have geographic diversity, and I think that's a good idea to strive for. However, I think the risk would be down the road, if one of the existing members needs to come off the board for some reason and you're looking for a replacement, it would be a shame if there was the perfect candidate out there to sit on the board, but that person couldn't be selected because they simply don't have the right zip code. So I think you want to make sure you somehow have the flexibility to be able to select the people that have the best skill sets. I think it's going to be much harder to come up with people for that committee that have the right skill sets as opposed to the correct zip code. So I just think it's important to maintain that ability to be flexible in the selection of those people. So thanks.
Just a thought for you, Brad, and I was going to try not to say much, but this may help other people understand some thinking. I've spent a fair bit of time talking with Dan Short, who's our county finance director, and we just came through our budget process, which is pretty epic undertaking, honestly, and you really look at broad categories and a lot of line items and that sort of thing. And what he was envisioning at this point anyway, if it was just left to him, is creating three funds that would represent the 3 buckets. And as the tax money came in, he would allocate them into those 3 funds. The 25%, the 25%, and the 5%. And that would be if I understood him correctly, that would be pretty much the set routine. And then you have the 45% that can move where it's needed. If you didn't have a good project, or what I would anticipate more likely is that you have great projects, but they take time, they have to go through an environmental impact statement for a forestry project or a conservation easement or some other transaction of that nature, just may take more than, may extend beyond the calendar year you're working in. But you can save that money. It can stay in the fund and be allowed to build up and be used that way, as well as moving the 45 around. One thing I will ask them about it is sort of the idea maybe of almost borrowing from one fund to another. If you were in that situation, that conceivably could work. The main thing is just tracking it all from his end. But so I think there is probably a fair bit of flexibility that's sort of already envisioned for dealing with those types of situations.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Gift Kriebel, 618 G Street, Salida. I understand the importance of geographic diversity on the committee. I think possibly even more important is community of interest diversity. If we got a committee that was all realtors, all ranchers, all small business people, they're going to bring a certain slant. And I think it's important that we have a broad representation between the business community, the conservation community, the environmental advocacy committee, the agricultural interests. And I think that is equally as important as geographic diversity.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Alan Robinson, 33700 Mount Harvard Circle, in Buena Vista. First, an appreciation for the efforts of Cindy and Rick to have put all of this together.
I think they can.
To the tremendous effort that's gone into this, but it's really a question for a little clarification on your survey of other counties and other jurisdictions. I note that in all of those, or it appears in all of those that you talked to, they were not, in effect, tackling all three aspects all at once. And I wonder if when you explained to them the circumstances of our ballot initiative, they gave you any insight on how, other than what you have summarized in general, any insight on how best to deal with all three of those? Or did they find that they had chosen not to do so in the case of their own situation because they found it too daunting, or had they simply not considered that?
That's a great question. I don't think we saw a community that had a setup quite as complex as what we've set up here in Chaffee County with all three of those buckets. There's a lot of communities that have two of them, kind of the rec piece and the open space agricultural piece. But we didn't see one with quite this level of mix, especially on the forest health side, which seems to be in some ways the least explored piece, maybe I'd say. The counsel I heard most when we talked about that with folks is that counsel around being patient and making sure that the community is allowing itself space to not have to get it perfect right at the front end, right? I mean, that what we heard is it's going to take 2 or 3 years to figure out all the pieces, and don't be freaked out if everything doesn't work on the first try. So I think patience is maybe the one that I heard the most from them. I don't know what you have to add to that, Rick?
I agree with you, Cindy, but I think that when we described what we're doing, people said, what? It really is unique, and I think it's well tailored to the needs of this community, but it isn't something that has been done elsewhere that we have a model to follow. So I think we're going to have to be really thoughtful as we implement this.
I'm strongly supportive of that combination of the three buckets, but I just realize that it may be daunting to provide adequate coverage to all three at once. But Greg's comment on potentially establishing some separate accounts, which could be set aside to deal with some of those. I think that's the kind of flexibility that you might want to have in order to deal with all three of these complex things at the same time. I do have a separate question, and it has to do with actually simply the timing at which funding can first be made available. I know there's been some comments in some other stuff that you have written that might be to go ahead even within this year to have such a cycle, or even 2 cycles, but I wasn't aware that the funding could be made available that quickly from the sales tax. But if you could just comment on that time.
Yeah, there's a 2-month lag from when sales tax is collected to when it comes into our treasurer's office, I guess. And so we expect that money will start coming in March. And I think the limitation on what we do really is the time it takes to get this whole system program constituted and develop good assessment or scoring mechanisms and feel like we're ready to push the button. We have certainly talked about early wins, and Cindy sounded some cautionary notes about that, but we also don't want to miss opportunities. I mean, this is a challenge, I think, inherent in this sort of a arrangement where you are trying to balance a very structured, transparent, reliable system with a world that doesn't follow those rules necessarily, both from the opportunity side or from the sort of more emergent side. And so that's something that we're going to need to figure out. But I always get hung up on the word biannual, if it means once every 2 years or twice every 1 year, but I'm thinking of it as twice every 1 year, so I don't know. But anyway, and I asked Cindy and she couldn't tell me either, but I saw that word up there, I think, or maybe it was something else she handed me, but that's certainly something to consider too, is can you have a twice yearly grant cycle? This is where I think this idea of the grant management software is making a lot of sense, because when you look at the timelines on some of these potential proposals, like I mentioned a minute ago, that require NEPA analysis or that require complex transactions, it'll become trickier to manage the different buckets, the floating 45 over multiple years, things that have been committed to and things that are new ideas that just have an urgent quality to them. And this is something that I think the Community Advisory Council is going to spend a lot of time working out, just like Rick alluded to with the Marijuana Excise Tax Advisory Board. The more they thought about it, the more things there were to kind of get in place. So.
I just return to your point that I think the flexibility, you observed that many of these anticipated projects may take a considerable amount of time to be prepared to actually implement, so that it seems to me that to take advantage of an opportunity, recognizing that it might be a deferred implementation, that it would be good for the board to recognize that some things need to be started now, but perhaps not funded now. But therefore, if you have a mechanism to set aside those funds, then you can start the process. And I'm thinking of starting a process with the public agencies, which may well take a year.
Yeah.
And yet they need to be assured that there is a fund at the end of that process, which if in fact they accept that their process recommends it, then that fund would be available.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I hate to keep talking here, but I did want to say one thing to your first point, because I thought it was a good one too, is that, like Rick said, these other communities that they looked at probably hadn't seen something quite as unique as this. I also believe that those communities probably hadn't gone through a process as unique as Envision Chaffee County. And that's really a testament to people in this room and many hundreds of others. We have done some really tremendous homework and soul searching and communicating, and I think what came together for us was we have these landscape scale challenges, and these are kind of, it's at least a way to characterize our landscape in terms of our forest issues, our outdoor recreation issues, and our agricultural open space type issues. So we are breaking new ground. We knew that. It's going to be a challenge, but I think we've already proven, at least you all have proven to me, that we're up for it. We'll find our way. Thank you. Thanks.
Test. Just to address early funding, I would think maybe, I would guess that health and safety, that would probably be one of the major criterias we would have. Something to that effect would be something that might get early funding, especially if maybe the government shutdown stays intact for a while. But health and safety would be one of those issues that we would consider.
My name's Lynn Drogas. I live at 7640 Meadowlark Drive in Salida. And I'm new to this, but I did take the time to read through the Envision document, and it is amazing. I haven't really had a lot of time. I just retired, so now I have more time to pay attention. But I noticed in the document that you did speak to somebody from Routt County about one issue or another, but with respect to all of the recreation, agriculture, forest management, they've done it all. There's a lot of good people up there. I worked for the Forest Service when they had the blowdown, and then they had the bark beetle epidemic, and then they had fire. So they've done a lot of work up there, and I'm happy to put you in touch with some people I know. They had a bark beetle task force, state, county, federal, municipal, and they brought the community together, talked about what was going to happen, how the forest was going to look different, how they were going to mitigate the big homesteads and things that had tons of trees around them. So anyway, good resources. So, thanks.
Thank you. Welcome to Chaffee County. Okay.
Tom Sullivan, 326 East 4th Street, Salida. Just some general comments. I think the Citizens Advisory Committee needs a strong conflict of interest policy, and it should be written. And anybody that, because I foresee conflicts of interest arising there. I think, or I believe that the grants for funding should be made available to the public, posted online, and they should be, and the Citizens Advisory Committee and the commissioners should accept public comments on those outside of the Citizens Advisory Committee. Have a deadline, grants posted, 30 days public comment, and then the commissioners deal with them. There are a lot of processes at the state level that use that. And I strongly caution the awarding of funding pre-decisional funding. I've been involved at the state level in a couple grant processes, and that's a nightmare when they award funding to projects that have not, that are not basically shovel ready, implementation ready. You're going to be dealing with public agencies here, EISs possibly, EAs, and other people are making decisions on those that the county cannot control. And if you award money to those and the decision does not go the way that you want it to, or it's delayed by litigation or something like that, it's going to be a big mess. So, I would just say wait. Don't award money pre-decisionally. If you want to award money for planning, you could do that as opposed to implementation. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. That's actually comments that I hadn't heard before, particularly about the public being involved in commenting on proposed grant applications. That's a good thought.
Do you feel there's a dollar limit on an application that maybe the public really doesn't need to be involved with, or?
I think leave it up to the public. If somebody feels strongly enough to comment on it, let them do it.
Okay.
And they might not do it at all, but give the public that opportunity.
Yeah.
Don't hide it in the CAC.
Interesting. Other comments?
Jim Osborne, 37380 US Highway 24 North, Buena Vista. Having been through some of this process when I was commissioner, starting with the grant writing and also getting some of the land trust stuff going in the county, I would strongly advise that in the 3 groups that may be set up, that not only there's diversity amongst those groups, but the diversity to include all areas, again, of the county, as has been already suggested, and thank you for that. But when there is a vacancy in one of those groups, that prior to what the gentleman said earlier, I would suggest that if there's not someone that can fill that vacancy from that particular geographical location or area, that go vacant until someone can be appointed or is willing to fill that position. Because if you don't do it that way, then you're going to get what has happened before with various boards in this county, and that is you'll get more and more people from a select group or from a certain area, and then it gets overweighted or top-heavy with, say, people from whatever it might be, water interests or ranching interests or realty interests, whatever it might be. So take that caution, and there's nothing wrong with having a vacancy for a while, or who knows, it might be quite a while. Another comment would be make sure that we have good criteria to work with the federal agencies, to sit down with them and make sure that they can meet when necessary with the Citizen Advisory Board. Having gone through this process before, when I was commissioner, that was a real problem, to find time when they could meet with us. They get to be so busy at certain times, not all the time, but at certain times, and so you have to be able to adjust when you can meet with those particular entities. And one other thing then would be to, we're looking at probably a 2 to 3 year period before everything gets really set up and finalized. Let's let that money sit there until, you know, that tax dollar is going to accumulate. Okay, maybe at the end of 2 years we might have $2 million in that fund. Take that fund and set that money aside and put it into something that's going to draw interest. And maybe we can feed it more and develop more through a good interest-bearing fund, and then be able to take those funds out and keep that fund going without having to worry about it in the long run. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
I have to have my cheat notes. Jeannie Younghouse, 30775 County Road 371, Buena Vista. I have 2 questions. The first one, though, is on these communities in progress.
Step up to the mic.
Oh.
Turn it down toward your mouth.
Okay, is it better?
Yes.
Okay. When we're talking about the communities in progress, the Community Wildlife Protection Plan, Envision Recreation and Balance, and Community Conservation Exchange, I know, I saw the funding you said was available, so does that mean, but I'm a little confused, is the Community Conservation Exchange Program agriculture? And then I assume recreation and balance, of course, is so these are not really the 3 areas per se that we're working with?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for.
That's why it's confusing to me, and I know there's some funding you already have, but.
Yeah, thanks for asking for clarity. Those are each community-involved planning processes. So the Community Wildfire Protection Plan will seek to engage the community to update the current wildfire protection plan we have, which is about 10 years out of date. The Recreation and Balance Program is seeking to develop a county-wide recreation impact monitoring system and a community-advised set of recommendations for the future of recreation. And then that third, the Working Lands Helping Hands piece, the Community Conservation Exchange specifically is working to set up that system, be it payment for ecosystem services or whatever it may be, working with local ranchers to understand how those funds might get distributed. So that's kind of a new planning piece to set
Okay,
up.
so you have these 3 areas, and you've got the grant money. So are you going to develop these first?
Those plans
to then figure out how they're going to impact your 3 different areas?
I think those plans, you might speak to it too, Greg, but I think those plans will help inform use of funds, but they won't be like the mechanism where every single use of funds has to come through those plans. There may well be things that are outside of those plans as well. And I don't know that you have to have those plans all the way done before you start to bring some things that are early wins like we talked about to the table.
And this may come into my second question, is the comprehensive plan. So are you hoping to put all of this together in some kind of a mechanism and then have it available when you do the comprehensive plan? And if not, you can explain why. Oh, and also, is there any money at this point to do the comprehensive plan, which is out of date? Those are my...
Sure. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, in terms of your first question about the strategic visions, this kind of relates back to what I was saying earlier about the big picture view. We can't always confuse where something happens with its direct benefit. There can be something that happens in the forest that looks like a forest health problem, but it's designed to benefit source water protection. And you can have a broader strategic impact that way. Same with ag lands and so on when it comes to aquifer recharge. Now, about the comp plan, ideally, we would have a plan set up, and then we go through this step, then we go through that step, then we fund these particular programs. We evaluate each grant request in terms of that plan. Unfortunately, the world doesn't really work that way. We have to work some of these things in parallel, and we can't let, the saying is, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. We are starting on the comp plan process. We have submitted a request to DOLA, the Department of Local Affairs, for funding to help us out with that. We have just finalized a request for proposals from consulting companies to help us out with that. That's gone out, and we're on the timeline to get a consulting company under bid to help us out with that and start on that process. Some of these plans will be the way that we have envisioned this is they will be annexes or appendices to the comp plan. So the comp plan will be the overall master comprehensive plan. There'll be things like transportation master plan, water plan, forest health plan, wildfire mitigation plan, probably any number of others. So they can be updated on a more frequent basis, taken out either literally or figuratively, and the new one updated and inserted in there so that our planning becomes a less painful but ongoing process. And then something that we want to do in that scoring criteria is to take a look at each project in terms of its plan, or in terms of the plan in which it supports. How well does it support it? Does it fit in? Does it have multiple benefits across a variety of plans so that we get a broader impact for each grant?
And is there any time limit? Once you start the comprehensive plan, you get your money and you start it, do you have a time limit when that's going to get finished?
We've given an up to figure to anybody who bids on this, and this is up to. This is like the hard wall out there, the edge of the cliff, of 18 months from when the project starts, which will be the springtime, I think is what our timeline calls for.
18 months to finish
18 months max.
Okay. Thank you.
We want a good product, but we want to get it done in a timely fashion too.
My name's Kent Maxwell, 9010 County Road 240 in Maysville. Had a question, I guess three main comments here about the timing part for the grant cycle, and if you're talking about a biannual grant cycle. My support for ballot 1A was about the persistence of effort on the wildfire mitigation side. And for a lot of these projects, either it's going to require hiring staff on some of the workers, the boots on the ground that would actually get the work done. And if you only are applying for something that's only going to be good for 6 months, then in terms of that hiring piece, is it possible without violating the multi-year financial obligations to get to where you could apply to do work that would take place several years, and so maybe have some sort of benchmark and renewal possibility every year. That would be one concern that I would have. And then also with some of the equipment required for some of the forestry work, the fire mitigation, the issues in the past have been we maybe get the piece of equipment purchased but don't have the funding for the maintenance and operation. Specifically the grinder that the county bought for the landfill operation to do the slash grinding, but then couldn't keep up with the maintenance part of it, and then that kind of got sidelined piece, so I can see that being an issue. And then on the leveraging part, if the funding is tied to getting outside dollars or more heavily weighted to bring in money from some of the mitigation forest health projects, and their cycles are so intermittent, and specifically the way the fire borrowing takes place for the U.S. Forest Service, and they have a big fire year. They steal the money to do the mitigation prevention to actually pay for the firefighters. And so then that money just disappears. And so good ideas, good projects could get sidelined. My work with the fire department and with the nonprofit Wildland Firefighter School I run, some of our best projects have been from failed grants in terms of somebody said no, but we had a good idea and we found a way to make it happen. And so I wouldn't want the Citizens Advisory Board to be set up to say no to projects just because you don't have an extra dollar or two to go along with it. And so some of the in-kind work, this community thrives on volunteer effort, and so getting support for projects based upon what labor you can bring and what else can you bring to the table besides just cold hard cash. So those are my comments.
Yeah, especially these kind of projects like trail crews and fire mitigation efforts and things like that, in kind can be a tremendous leverage.
Now I have to lower it.
You got to lower it.
Andrew Mackey, 245 East 2nd Street, Salida. I am also the executive director of the Central Colorado Conservancy. I just want to do 3 quick things. One is thank the commissioners for bringing this to vote for the people, and thanking Cindy and Rick for all their work and all that research. Second is there were some comments made about conservation easements earlier. I would offer the support of the Central Colorado Conservancy in any public meetings or any advisory meetings about what conservation easements are and how they work. They are very complicated legal agreements. There are very specific regulations around them and requirements, conservation values, things that are defined by the IRS and the state of Colorado. So it can be very complicated to understand that and how the tax credit works and the federal deduction and all that. So any assistance we can give, we'd be happy to do that. Third is to Cindy and Rick. I'm just curious, in your research, did you find any input from those counties about how they evaluated the effectiveness of the dollars spent in grants and how they adapted and changed to that?
Thanks, Andrew. I don't recall any of the open space type organizations having a review of effectiveness, but Ashland, Oregon had a very interesting process where they have volunteers go out and evaluate different parts of their watershed for where fire mitigation is needed, do inventories, then they would contract to have the work done, and then they have citizens go back out and evaluate how effective that's been in terms of renewing the land. So their model in terms of planning, execution, and then follow on to see how effective it is, seems like a very good model that we should consider.
I think a lot of communities were also relying a bit on, it's almost a popularity of the program. A lot of them were up for 10-year renewals, and they looked at a measure of their success as in how strong the vote was when they came for renewal. We also heard from a lot of communities that they measured around public engagement and public support, but I didn't see anybody, we didn't ask that question specifically, it's a good question. I didn't see anybody that had a system set up to measure outcomes. It's a good question.
It does seem like a critical element of this over time. And
Yeah, we didn't ask
I
that.
know that some of it is, even without a formal evaluation process, I know, like with the Marijuana Excise Tax Advisory Board, there's an awful lot of lessons learned that go on, and unforeseen consequences, and working through that, and then somehow documenting it so that that's not lost. But I think that would be a really important element to try to build into this whole project.
Yeah, I think there's two stages of that. Is one, evaluating the project itself and its effectiveness as to what it was designed to do, and then later on, the secondary wave of the economic benefit, the overall economic benefit to the community. What is this investment paid off, like, $2 generated from every dollar invested or something like that.
When we sort of conceived this whole ballot measure, we built in an annual audit to the ballot language, and then something we sort of came upon as we continued with the campaign, but after the language had been set, was the idea of an annual report to the community that would be, readable, something that, that you would be interested in looking at, but that would really spell out what had gone on in the year before. And I think that element too feeds into this, in the sense of making sure the community is being kept up to speed, potentially at the level that Tom Sobel was talking about, where people have an opportunity to actually look at what's being proposed and comment on it before it goes anywhere, but also being made aware each year of these are the things that we're invested in. And so they have the opportunity to kind of keep track of those on their own as well. And maybe in the context of that annual report, that'd be a good place to have an update on projects that happened 2, 3, 5 years ago, that kind of thing. So you sort of get a little sense of the effectiveness of the program over time. And of course, that would be in the interest of people who were supportive of the program or felt like it was going well. We'd want to provide a good accounting of what's gone on over time. I think that an annual report ought to be more than just what happened that year, potentially.
Commissioners, I'd like to know if you foresee, we talked about a staff person here working with the county or from the county. Do you foresee that to be a full-time position with the county or just a volunteer position?
When we were having our hearings back in September, I think it was, in October, that question came up, and I'll say that I was really, there will be no FTE, as we call them, right, full-time employee. But I think we have seen that there is, certainly we're going to have to spend some time in the finance office managing these accounts, and that just kind of gets rolled into the cost of doing business. I think we have identified from these best practices and this research that there is an important communication role that needs to go on if you want to have a transparent program and if you want to have an effective program. So that's something that needs to be fleshed out over these next several meetings that we talked about. But I think that would more than likely be a contracted position. Like we have an assistant who helps with the Marijuana Excise Tax Advisory Board. We have, it's more of a full-time position, but we have, Scott Peterson, who works with the Chaffee County Visitors Bureau. These aren't employees per se, they're contracted for a specific scope of work. And so on that communications piece, I could imagine definitely a need for that, but not somebody who's sitting at a desk in the county and, is a full-time employee of the county.
Well, yeah, and that makes sense from the fact, but, that person's going to have to be a very good contract person to be able to communicate not only with the board, but all the various entities in the county.
Yeah.
So that's a big job.
Yeah. And just as a reminder, too, in the ballot language, we did set a 5% cap on administrative costs. So, that wouldn't at $1 million a year, that would not cover a full-time employee when you talk about benefits and all that. But this communications type of role would, in talking with Dan Short, he felt, yeah, that would come out of that administrative 5%.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Becky Bigelow. My address is 550 East 3rd Street in Salida, and I'd like to talk about the topic of subject matter experts in your project selection. And I would like to emphasize the importance of utilizing the most current science and research in applying subject matter experts and decision-making on project selection and methods. My background is I am a hydrologist, and I've worked with the National Department of Interior Burned Area Emergency Response Team for 22 years, also with the Forest Service bear teams, and I have visited hundreds of very large fires across the country and worked in the area of forest health and land management practices, watershed health, and over my career, I've seen those practices evolve greatly and change radically 180 degrees from one method to another. And it's extremely important to utilize the most recent research. Consider utilizing such subject matter experts from possibly outside areas. I think it's a good idea to utilize state and federal agency experts as well as academic institutions. Colorado State University would be a good place to obtain advisement and keep the options open in terms of leaning on the most recent science, because from my personal experience, I have seen many fires that were exacerbated by using outdated practices of forest health, forest management techniques. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really good points. I appreciate that.
Dan Jones, 4141 County Road 210. Two questions. One is piggybacking on what Jim Osborne said, wondering about suggestion of developing an MOU with federal, state, and other related public agencies so that as appointments to those departments in this area, as they change, you don't have to go back and talk to the new person all over again. I think that Park County has done an excellent job of this when it came to lands that they wanted to see protected, and so they ended up getting various state, federal, private, public agencies all together, got them to sit down and talk about these things. And I know that over the many years that this has been ongoing in Park County, that lots of different people at the helm of these organizations have changed, but those MOUs had been in place, so those agreements were already reached. The other thing is more addressed to the Board of County Commissioners. In my 30 years of being here in the county, I sat on at least one committee very similar to the Envision Committee. We made recommendations to the Board of County Commissioners. It was included in the comprehensive plan. Then there was a change of administrations, and when the change of administrations came, there was no longer the support, even though it was in the comprehensive plan. And so all those recommendations, which are very similar to Envision, all those languished. There was no support. The commitment to the funding dried up, went away. I'm just wondering what the Board of County Commissioners will do to try and put in place protections so that just because you have a sales tax does not mean that it's protected. So what will be done to try to ensure that this is a program that carries on in the future?
I think that's a good question, Dan. And I believe that the ballot language that we used is not subject to the whims of different administrations and different changes in agency personnel. The resolution that we drafted to sort of maybe further flesh out the ballot language is, I think, is potentially something that could be messed with, honestly. It's just the way it is. But the good thing about a resolution is, in my opinion, you would have to overturn the resolution as a Board of Commissioners. And at a minimum, you've got a public process that you got to deal with there. I feel confident that this money is protected in terms of being allocated to the 3 funding buckets and the broader descriptions of what those buckets are, and that the 45% is not subject to appropriation into whatever the cause of the day is. But I think that as we move forward with the development of the program here over the next several months or so, it'll be appropriate to put those decisions into resolution format as well, so that at least we've got them as strong as we can have them. For somebody to take the tax money and use it for another purpose, basically they would have to go back to the voters in terms of changing that ballot language, so that's my thoughts on that.
So one other thing, on the committee that I sat on, we also had a citizen advisory committee. And that was all set up and approved, but then with the change of administration, there was no ear to that citizen advisory committee anymore. So that's how some of these things languished and just never came about, even though, like I said, they were included in the comp plan.
Gotcha. Do you have anything to add to that, Jenny? Jenny Davis is our county attorney. She might have a little legal to add.
Yeah, and can you hear me? Oh, there we go. Yeah, and I'm aware of that situation, but in terms of this Citizen Advisory Committee, the resolution requires that it mentions the Citizen Advisory Committee and that the allocation, not the allocations, but that the distributions and the grants are the final decision is the commissioners, but it's with the recommendation of the Citizens Advisory Committee. So I can't see a situation that you're describing where the committee's going to recommend something and the board lets the money just sit in those funds. I mean, that it needs to take some sort of action with it. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but...
You know, one other thought that comes to mind too, Jenny, that I think was something that was well done is that in the ballot measure, I believe the resolution that supported the ballot measure was Exhibit A that was referenced in the ballot measure, which to me feels like you're tying those two as closely as you can together, and it makes it, to me, you would definitely have to override that resolution, and that would be in conflict with what the people voted on.
Right, that framework would not be able to be changed, as you said, without a vote. And that was intentional to address those types of concerns that other folks were raising during the process.
Jim Osborne again. Jenny, a question for you. Greg, also, you guys have a resolution that you say you're going to follow through with this, but is that a binding resolution that makes sure that you do or the board does follow through with whatever it might be concerning this tax initiative, and et cetera? But also, can that be a binding resolution on commissioners that would follow? And would that have to go to a vote of the people to make sure that the people vote on making sure that this is followed through with every new group of commissioners?
The subsequent resolution, the resolution that the commissioners are getting your feedback from in order to develop, that resolution could be changed. So, the short answer is yes, it could be changed by future administrations.
Okay, but could that go to a vote of the people to make sure that that can't be the process unless the people vote on it?
I don't believe so. I think there's limitations in the referendum process at a county level like that, because that's taking power away from the commissioners. I guess you could amend the tax and build it into the tax portion of it, just like right now, what the voters approved was that there will be a Citizens Advisory Committee that's advising the board on how the funds will be distributed. So you could add more into it, I suppose, that would include things like these are the groups where the people from that will make up the Citizens Advisory Committee, these are the groups that they're going to be picked from. You could go into that kind of detail. I think that would be a difficult thing to get passed because there's going to be a lot of disagreement as to what that's going to look like. And frankly, you might want some flexibility in those types of things. What was talked about earlier is that there's going to be a big learning curve going on throughout the process, and there might be things in the resolution that a year from now or 5 years from now or 10 years from now you're going to want to be able to change as the county changes.
So I guess part of the question is, given all the support and groundswell that we have for the Envision program and the passage of 1A, then is there any way that this board, this sitting board of county commissioners, can do what they can do to strengthen it so that there's not some way in which it can be whittled away from the original intent of the passage of 1A?
Yes, Dan, and I'm not being trite or third grady here, but the best thing we can do is establish a good, transparent program that has credibility with all of you who voted for it, and establish it for the long term and put it on good legs for the future, and make it a program that the county, all of us, can be proud of, that everybody has a high level of confidence in, and it has enough credibility that nobody would ever go after it again.
I think we will explore the question, though, too, and if there are things that we can do with the help of legal to, undergird this even more than we have, I think we'd certainly be interested in doing that.
I'm Reed Dills, 29940 County Road 353E, Buena Vista, Colorado. Boy, Dan brought up some very sad memories, because I was on that same board with Dan. I can understand why he's worried. I think the good news is that you've got this initiative, you've passed the law, and the money is separate from your regular budgetary process. So that means that you can't use it for something else, you can't take it away. That's good. And I'd like to also agree with what Becky had to say, because the more you study about forest health and forest fire things, there's a lot of information out there, and it's going to take a long time for this group to figure out what can work and what can't work, and what's already going on in the state of Colorado. There are huge projects going on statewide. Cindy knows this, and a lot of other people do too. And it's going to take a long time just to figure out where we fit in, or how we can take advantage of what's already happening in this state, because we have already had the problems in other parts of the state with beetle kill and forest fires and things like that. And I think the more, with all the fires that they've had in California, and if you've read a lot of the articles that have come out recently by some of the major news organizations about what went well and what didn't go well, that's a good thing for you to learn from. But the bottom line on all the forest health issues and the fire safety things, it really boils down to two things. It's what you guys decide to do, and do you have the backing of your population here. A good example is what happened in Redding, California last year. They did all of this stuff. They did everything they should have done for fire prevention protection, but when it came time to go before the county commissioners and have the money spent, well, we got other issues. We're not going to deal with that. Or they'd have people in the real estate community said, "Oh, you can't do that. That's private property issues, and you can't force people to protect their property properly." So with that being said, the other thing I would recommend in a lot of these things is go slow. Make sure you don't have to jump into this and start spending money right away. Make sure that the board is educated and the commissioners are educated before you make decisions. Some of them will be easier than others, but I think when you get into forest health, fire mitigation, that kind of thing, it's going to take some time to figure out what you really want to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Reed.
Hello, Jim LaRue, 12144 West US Highway 50. First of all, I'd like to thank Cindy and Rick for the hard work. I was at some of the first meetings, and it's been a long, long process. One question I do have is for the CAC, is there term limits? And my thought was the longer the term limits, the better, because if you get a good board going, you'd hate to break up the party. And also a follow-up on what Ms. Brown was saying and also what Andrew was saying about conservation easements. My wife and I did one just west of Poncha Springs here in 2014 on the old Hoover Ranch. We didn't have $10 in our pocket. The fees were a killer. With help from my father-in-law, we were able to do all the fees. There's lawyers, appraisals, surveys, a lot of out-of-pocket expenses before you get to get the prize. for someone like us, we didn't have the money to do the upfront costs, but there's several trophy ranches or hobby farms that are executive ranches that those people can definitely upfront the money. So I think consideration needs to be taken into that as far as the easements. I know a lot of guys that I've talked to, because I push easements pretty hard, conservation easements. I like to tie the water up to the county, keep the water in the county. Front Range can dry up. But a lot of these ranchers they're having sticker shock by the fees that come along with it, and they've gone up considerably since we did ours. So that's one thing I think can help with a lot of these guys that are working ranches, that they work there. They're not just fly in and play. So that's about all I had. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
In terms of your question about term limits, we discussed this with a number of the communities, and we've learned a few things. One community, most of the members of their land and water fund have been on that board for 12 years or more, and they've kind of separated from the commissioners. So I think that it's wise to not limit the terms of people on a citizens advisory committee like this, especially when the subject matter is as complex as we're going to be dealing with here. But at the same time, people should be reappointed on a regular basis. So what we're proposing is something like 3-year terms, where at the beginning of the board, some people will have a 1-year term, a 2-year term, and a 3-year term, and then everybody appointed after that would have to be appointed every 3 years. This is not the Supreme Court. You're not on it for lifetime. But it does make sense to keep the Board of Commissioners and the Citizens Advisory Board connected by reappointments on a regular basis and by those groups coming together and meeting and updating each other so that the current commissioners understand the program and the people on the Citizens Advisory Board understand what the current community priorities are.
The METAB board was set up exactly like that because of that reason. It's reappointed by the commissioners, but there's no, and they're, I believe, 3-year terms, but there's no term limits, so they can be reappointed as long as they keep doing a good job.
Never had to do this before.
You gotta have a better system for that.
Reed McCullough, 17559 County Road 368. I want to start by saying congratulations to Cindy and to Central Colorado Conservancy, and also to the commissioners for a arduous effort to get here and a pretty tremendous success. So I'm excited for you to see that. Whenever I look at the use of public funds, I think the first question that comes to mind for me is who benefits? And so now that these funds are going to be coming in, I hope that that is something that rings through the ears of the Citizens Advisory Committee going forward as we look at some of the efforts. And I'll give you a couple examples of some of the things that I've heard about, and I wonder how these play out. For example, when we look at fire mitigation, we need to recognize that there's a lot of development in the county that is out in forested lands that are adjacent to public lands. Might as well be forest or public lands in terms of fire risk. And yet, when we go to fire mitigation, who is going to benefit from the expense of those public funds? And if so, if those are going to, especially trophy ranches or households of means, can we consider some sort of contribution or participation in that so that we don't just benefit single individuals or single households with public funds? I think there'll be a significant public backlash if that's perceived to be true. Another example I've heard of this idea, and I think it's a brilliant idea, of looking at households or ranchers who are land rich and cash poor, and offering them some sort of an annual subsidy to prevent them from having to sell out their lands to a developer or their water rights. So giving them perhaps $8,000, $10,000 a year to keep those lands in operation. What happens when ultimately that ranch is sold? If those are public funds put to use for that time, could there be a recapture or a repayment of some sort so that the public benefit was realized, and then when the public benefit is no longer realized and the family or the household does realize a cash benefit from the sale, could those funds be paid back? So I hope that just ongoing, the question of who benefits is constantly applied to the use of these funds, because over time, these are a significant amount of funds, and the public needs to be reassured that they are benefiting from these things. Thank you.
Really interesting thought, Reed. I appreciate that.
Lucy Waldo, Central Colorado Conservancy, 128 East 1st Street is our office. I actually live in Gunnison County, so I was not voting on this issue, but I do shop here, so I'm paying for this, which is a good thing.
Yeah. You're the model customer.
Yeah, right. Just leave my money, right? So I wanted to say thank you to everybody who worked so hard on getting broad public support behind this. And I wanted to bring up two things. One is, as a person who works with conservation easements and in conservation in general, I support the twice yearly opportunity for grants, because we need, it helps us to have flexibility to ask for money when it the other granting organizations and the landowners that we're working with. So that would be helpful to us to have two opportunities. And then I also wanted to comment on, I have to put my glasses on here, okay. Staff support. I was talking with a rancher who had a good idea for that. He said he was familiar with some NRCS offices that have, so NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, is a federal agency. And sometimes they have staffers who are paid in a sharing situation. So they're paid partly with federal funds and then partly with funds from an organization such as Ducks Unlimited or something like that. So that might be a way to finance more staff support. I personally think that it's really, it would be a good idea to have some continuity. If you're working with a lot of volunteers and a lot of people in the community, it might be helpful to have some continuity in that staff support that can act as an anchor for some of the programs. Thanks.
Thanks, Lucy. Anybody else? Right at the 2-hour mark. All right, exactly. Okay. Any final words?
I want to give my word of thanks to the public, and I know a lot of you've left, but during the campaign, people were asking us a lot of these questions, and we didn't have good answers to every one of them. But we extended the assurance that we were going to be going through this process, and I said, you know, I have to admit, in many respects, the voters, we're asking the voters to press the I believe button, that they have confidence in the county commissioners to carry through with the process and to try to do our best efforts to make this a good, viable program in its implementation after the ballot issue was passed. Well, you've implied a great deal of confidence and responsibility in us by passing this ballot measure, and we feel that responsibility, and we're going to do our best to make sure it's a program that not just our generation can be proud of, but multiple generations can be proud of, and people look back many years from now and say one of the smartest things that Chaffee County ever did was passing that ballot measure in 2018.
Yeah. Right. I just wanted to say this is my first official day, and I think
You had 2 full meetings. It's been 14 hours long.
What a day. Thank you. But one of the smartest things I can do is listen and really apply the many comments that were made tonight. I think they were right on the mark of what we're looking at, and great comments to move forward with. So thank you for being here and sharing that with us.
I know there were other events going on tonight that people had to attend. I know there was some riveting television. It started at 7 o'clock. I know we're all kind of curious what may have happened during this meeting. But just a quick reminder, this entire meeting's been taped and will be on YouTube, which will be available through our county website. We'll get that link out hopefully tomorrow. The PowerPoint that Cindy and Rick referenced will be on the website, county website, chaffeecounty.org, tomorrow. So if you have people in your circle who couldn't make it and want to see that, it'll be there. And then we will certainly take comment January 15th in Buena Vista, 9 o'clock at the school district offices. And we'll take comment on the 22nd too, but I think we're going to be trying to zero in by then, so comment probably is more helpful sooner than later. And then, of course, people can always write to us. You can write to us individually. It's R. Granzella, G. Felt, K. Baker at chaffeecounty.org.
Notice a pattern?
You can send written comments, call us. So please help spread the word in that regard. And I would like to end maybe with just a round of applause for Cindy and Rick. They really put a lot into this. We appreciate it. Meeting adjourned.
Thanks.
Oh.